Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show. And for those of you who are new to this program, check out our archives. We've got lots of great interviews with past smart CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs of all kinds of companies. We've got Netflix, Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation, Blizzard, Lending Tree, and many more. I'm also the co-founder of Rise 25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And I'm so excited to have this guest on here. Most of my guests come from a product of my own outreach. I got a never-ending stream of people that I'm interested in interviewing. This one actually was from an incoming solicitation, which is rare. But as soon as I saw it, I said, I really want to interview this guy. So this is Craig Swanson. He's one of the co-founders of CreativeLive, which is one of the first streaming educational platforms out there. We'll talk about it in a moment. I actually was a guest on Dory Clark's CreativeLive a number of years ago, and it was such a thrill to do. But he's got so many other things that he's done. Longtime entrepreneur, partner in KaisaFit, which is an online fitness platform, also partner in the wedding school and online education for wedding photographers and portrait photographer business as well. Go check out for other podcast interviews of him. Built to Sell podcast interview where he kind of talks about exiting those businesses. But he loves entrepreneurial challenges of growing businesses from low six figures to $1 million and more. And he also is the chair of the Accelerator program in EO Seattle. I'm a graduate of that program. It's an amazing program for any entrepreneur out there who wants to go be able to break seven figures. So go check it out. And of course, before we get into this interview, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. You can learn all about what we do at rise25.com. All right, Craig, such a pleasure to have you here. And I want to start, you're a longtime entrepreneur. You're, so many people I interview, some come from some completely technical, they're an accidental entrepreneur, didn't intend to become an entrepreneur, but you seem like you had it in you from a young age to the point where, like many entrepreneurs, you had a paper route, but that wasn't enough. You also had a creative way of generating more money during that paper route. What did you do?
So I my first paper out at 10 because I was in a small town that allowed you to do that. Then I moved to Seattle and you had to be 12. And so I had to wait like a year before I got my paper out. Got my paper out at 12, got the largest number I could get. I think I had like 350 papers on this thing. And then I realized I was like cycling through the summer and like riding my bike through this. So I went down to downtown. I got a wholesaler license. I got a business license. And I basically built an ice cream truck that I carried on the back of my bicycle when I was delivering newspapers. And so I was delivering newspapers, riding through all the neighborhoods and selling ice cream at the same time. And
it's not enough that you're lugging all these newspapers. You also have to lug a refrigerated ice cream thing.
I think so. We couldn't do it on Wednesdays because Wednesdays are thick papers, and we certainly didn't even try to do it on Sundays. But yes, basically, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday are nice light papers. We could totally throw in some the ice cream cart in the back. And I think. And
do you remember being 12 years old and either telling your parents or showing up downtown? This 12-year-old saying, I want to get a commercial license. I mean, do you remember that experience? I
really wish. So I suspect I just showed up. I just told my parents one day that I had got the commercial license and needed a ride to the wholesale building because I need to pick this stuff up. That would be my style. In fact, so I have a son. I have a son who just turned 20. And I remember when he turned 13, I called up my parents and I said, so what did you do when I was 13 to encourage me to go do this stuff? And they just looked at me and shook their head and said, we had nothing to do with that. Like you would come home with these ideas and start building stuff. And this was definitely if there was nurture in it, there was a lot of nature built into that. There was a lot that you just kind of took and ran with.
Well, it does, it does get into a whole nother conversation about nature versus nurture in entrepreneurship. But the next thing I want to ask you about is when you got to high school, You were involved in your high school newspaper. I was involved in my high school newspaper, mid 90s. At that time, there was some really early primitive software that we were using, but you were digitizing your high school newspaper from an early age. This was probably moving from, laying things out physically, I imagine, to doing it more on a computer. What was that like?
So in let's see here. The Apple Macintosh had come out. So I graduated in 1988. So between 1984 and 1988 is kind of when the first Macintosh came out. And I think the first Adobe laser printer came out around that time. So my first year in the newspaper, we would send out our type to a Linotronic typesetting house. So it was part of the district, and they would basically type these things up and send them out to us. And I wanted to do some special things. So I literally would ride my bike out because I didn't have a car at that time. And I would be telling the ladies what I wanted because I wanted special headlines and these other things. And I don't know why people just let me, they let me talk my way into things, but they literally let me get in front of the machine and start typing in that old code, how to do my own typesetting. And then let me do custom stuff and output this.
Right. Good way of getting rid of you. Just let them do it.
Maybe I'm astounded by it. So a year later, that same journalism department bought the first laser printer back when laser printers were brand new.
And not cheap probably at that point.
No.
Too.
And this would have been, and we were using PageMaker 1.0. It was probably an $8,000 laser printer, and and it would take forever to print. And we switched over from sending out from galleys of type to basically printing out on thick paper stock, printing it out, pasting up the I did the editorial board and a couple others. And I just loved it. I poured myself into this thing. And we pasted up. We did the paste up at a local printing press where the local weekly newspaper was printed for Redmond, Issaquah, and Bellevue. There was a weekly. I ended up pasting up my high school newspaper next to the guys that were doing the weekly production on the Bellevue Potpourri and the Kirkland Courier Review and the Redmond, whatever we called it. And then in my senior year, they hired me 30 hours a week to basically run the production department, to start doing the production department on computers because they were switching over and no one knew how to do it. So
and
I had a full-time job.
Kid over here is doing it for the local high school newspaper, obviously knows how to do it.
Exactly. So I was doing it for my local high school newspaper and then 3 local newspapers in the Seattle area.
Nice.
I say I dropped out of high school at that point. I just basically stopped going to high school at that point because I had a 30-hour-a-week job.
Yeah.
And I had an acceptance letter to the University of Washington that didn't include the paragraph that said based on future grades, which most of my friends had. So I said, okay, well, it's not based on future grades. So what do I care about future grades? So I just stopped going to school, except for, I think, journalism and calculus, and worked at the newspaper, did all this production, and then basically led into my first job right out of college, which was working with graphic designers.
I loved doing that work. So I was editor of my high school newspaper, and I loved laying it out. I loved taking these different stories, loved the creativity within the constraints of a newspaper. I remember driving, I lived in LA, so driving from San Fernando Valley all the way to Glendale, which is where our printer was, having to go there to check on things. And back then things would get messed up, and we'd get 1,000 papers printed up that had some major thing wrong with them because we didn't have a good way of getting proofs or anything like that. All kinds of mistakes and stuff that would happen. So
I am, what am I? I'm 52 now, and I've been in business basically since I was 18, 19. There is so much about my understanding about how you launch businesses, run life, and basically just kind of work as a creator and an entrepreneur from journalistic production. This idea of we went to press every week on Thursday. We were done.
Yeah.
We were done with the best work we could do up until the point that the deadline occurred, and then you ship.
Yeah.
So we shipped with the best thing we could every Thursday night. If I wanted to stay up till 1 a.m., I could do that. But basically, there's a point at which you ship. It doesn't matter if you've not filled in something. There's a white sheet. There's a white piece of paper that doesn't have your work on it that goes out printed the next morning.
And you can see that rhythm showing up in CreativeLive later, which I want to get to. But before we do it, it makes total sense that you eventually get into doing IT support for graphic designers, because this seems like it was kind of a next evolution, which was Swanson Tech Support. So talk about how you evolved from supporting those newspapers into this business?
So, I mean, effectively, I went to college as a graphic design major, realized that really I was a technology major and I loved working with creatives. So I started an IT company in 1988, which was teaching computers to graphic designers, ad agencies, design firms, and photography studios in the greater Seattle area. And the fact that I was 18 years old didn't mean anything in terms of my qualifications other than like maybe my professionalism and just, understanding of life, because nobody actually knew the technology at that point. And really from that year up until when I sold that business in 2010, through various variations, I just was working to create support systems generally around technology for commercial creatives, for photographers, for writers, for ad agencies, for design firms. I am very, very technical. I'm very, I've been able to sell my intelligence in trade for time and in trade for money, but it's always been within this support structure of helping creatives publish, create, find stability, and basically run their businesses around technology. So it's this way I've combined these two sides of me into something that I just absolutely love.
Yeah. Now, for you, one of the challenges early on was hiring. You said that was a big struggle for you, was getting good people in place and kind of replacing yourself and not being the one who was interwoven in the threads of the business. So talk a little bit about those early challenges.
I think my path, I would say is in really 7-year increments. I'm going through different phases. Like the first 7 years of my business, it was all about me. I was just struggling with time management, with pricing, with billing, with me just figuring out how to be me. And then the next 7 years are when I was trying to leverage and bring in other people, and was a terrible boss, didn't trust other people, was basically trying to I was trying to replicate myself instead of understanding what the company needed and how I could actually create a space for other people to be able to grow. And one of the things I learned along the way is there's a quality of partner and team member that I can never get onto my team until I grow to be a better leader and grow to create more space for them to be able to grow. And so I did what I think I see a lot of young entrepreneurs doing, which is I was trying to micromanage and cheap out and I was trying to basically get things off my plate while trying to control everybody that I brought into my sphere and not trusting them to do anything right. And so that combination of things brought me people that were willing to work with someone like that. And it was a self-fulfilling cycle.
Yeah. And actually one of your early hires, one of your first hires, actually ended up leaving shortly later. And that was a devastating impact for you. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So that was one of my very early, and hires is even maybe overstating it, because this is freelance. Where I was looking for lifetime permanent commitment from somebody, for them to be as emotionally involved in my company as I was, and yet I was trying to commit as little to them as possible. And at a time we were talking about potentially him coming as a partner in my business or trying to figure that out, he ended up becoming a partner in a competing business. And so not only did I lose the person I thought I was going to be able to work with to build into the next phase, but then he became my competitor, and basically I watched my competitor start to figure out things that I was struggling with.
That's devastating.
Yeah.
So this business kind of evolves, and Swanson Tech Support becomes CreativeTechs. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So around 2000. So around 2000, I started business when I was in 1988. So we had the .com bust, all this stuff. There were a lot of my clients that were design firms that were starting to go out of business. They were service-based design firms. Technology was shifting. And one thing that I started to notice is that in a service-based design firm, the people that had their name in the company name tended to have a lot less success creating anything that lasted beyond them. Now, there's probably indicators of other things beyond just the name itself. But when I looked at that and I looked at what I was trying to build, I really started to see that me creating something called Swanson Tech Support was branded around me. It wasn't branded about my audience.
Yeah.
It wasn't giving room for other people. And also there was just this mentality around it that was not what I wanted to build. And so I rebranded as CreativeTechs. We were techs for creatives. This was also probably the point at which I actively tried to be hiring people smarter than me with different skills than me. And I think started to get into the process of learning how to allow others to lead within my company and how to learn how to be a leader of leaders. I would say I was a fledgling at this, but I was starting to show signs of it. And I was starting to show signs of a business owner as opposed to just a single practitioner trying to like leverage other people to do what I tell them to do.
Now, what point did it was interesting. I was looking into your background. I was reading a couple of old blog posts here, and I saw the evolution of what became CreativeLive, which was so innovative when it came out. But you kind of baby stepped into it because you got into education and training. You kind of incubated the idea. At what point did you get involved with Chase Jarvis? And at what point did you start to test around with this idea of building this kind of platform?
So I had always loved education and writing. And so I even way back when I had written a newsletter for Photoshop 1.0. So way back when, so I'd always had some type of publishing mindset. But what became CreativeLive really started incubating inside of my IT company around the time that I had created enough space that other people were running most of the business. So at that point, I was not doing most of the client services. I was doing some of the sales. I had really good technicians that were doing most of the other work. And and also the company was profitable. So with all of those things, I like to joke that other business owners at that point, that's the point that they buy themselves a boat. And so I took my boat payment, and instead of buying a boat, I poured it into another hole that you can pour money into, which happened to be for me a internal startup, an internal online startup company. And this was I ended up hiring a really great trainer, Jason Hoppy, that was an expert trainer in Photoshop, Illustrator, and all the Adobe products. And then for about a year, we built out our own studio. And we were experimenting with this way of creating bite-sized education. My original vision was people were like, my clients were going to come here during lunch and have like lunch and learns. We were going to create all these different things. That wasn't really working. So like we were iterating around all these different ideas around trying to create different ways of create education.
And this was what, 2008, 2009 time period?
This would have been 2006, 2007, 2008. So like in this range.
And I think YouTube started in 2005. So we're talking early days of online video. Are you streaming it? Is it kind of live online, or is it recorded video?
So in the very early days, it was just a lunch and learn. So we were actually creating content that we could like basically deliver in an hour, and the idea that people would drive to be in person with us. So it wasn't even online. Okay. And then we weren't making any money. I mean, it's like I was spending, $60,000, $100,000 a year on my education program, and it probably brought in $5,000 a year. So it was not a it was not a very good business, but it was my love. And so in-person was not working. We thought, okay, let's switch to webinars. This new thing had just come out, GoToWebinar. We were playing with this thing. And so we started doing some virtual classes. And then I think really what ended up being the trick that like tripped over to make what CreativeLive is possible is we started experimenting with something that did both at the same time, where we took our in-person classroom, had people in person, and simultaneously did a broadcast to a webinar externally. So that the people watching externally, most webinars at the time had this dead performance of the person teaching because they were not talking to anyone. They were just talking to a screen. They had no sense of anything. So I wanted from Jason, I wanted his in-person audience. I wanted laughter. I wanted humor. I wanted him to be like responding to an audience in front of him. And so we ended up building this classroom that had about 5 or 6 people in person that were paying to take the class there. And then we had, 10, 11, 12 people that were tuning in remotely. And that created such an amazing connection. The instructor had an audience in person to react to. We had the people watching remotely that let us like support more people. And then I was making sure in the back end that I could like have their audio from the remote people come in. We did a lot of work to basically try to make this all work on where Jason's eye line was going. So all this said, we were doing all of these things to like try to create this hybrid classroom environment, which leads up to 2008 when the economy tanked. And we had the wave of banks going out of business. In fact, Washington Mutual Bank in Seattle was my biggest client, and they went out of business. So all of a sudden, this IT company that was running without me, that was giving me, the owner, my boat payment to go reinvest in my little favorite little hobby.
Did you get sucked back in? Did you have to cut the cord and get sucked back into running the IT company?
Basically, the IT company could no longer afford a do-nothing owner. So I needed to I needed to do something. And I remember I was going over spreadsheets. I was just I really didn't want to give up the classroom, but I knew that was the thing I needed to do. I basically needed to cut the classroom. You're a couple
years into it, and you're passionate about it. You built the studio, you got the momentum, and it's like devastating for you. Exactly. Yeah.
And I was going over spreadsheets. I was looking at Google Ads, and I was basically just saying, is there any way I can make this classroom pay for itself? And like, I was looking at what it would cost to do advertising, all these things. And this spreadsheet over this weekend, every time, like I was getting a 0 at the bottom or a negative number. Basically nothing I could do in terms of like pricing strategies or advertising was getting this thing to actually like not cost more than it was doing. And I remember just kind of like at one point just saying expletive, why don't we just give the thing away for free? I don't know if we can swear in your podcast, but basically just if I'm going to be losing money on this thing, why can't I just give this thing away for free? And at least we'll go out with a large audience. And so we basically scheduled the final class for this online course. It was a 10-week Photoshop course. So we had the curriculum all set up. And I had, at that time, I had about a 30,000 person email newsletter list that I built up over the years just because I liked writing. And we emailed everything and like put this over social and just basically said free 10-week Photoshop course, just show up. You can watch it when it's live. If you want recordings of it, you can pay for the recordings. And that basically is the CreativeLive model. That the very first week of that 10-week course, we had a 1,000 person license for GoToWebinar. And I genuinely thought the 1,000 person
was enough
bullet point. No, I thought the 1,000 person bullet point was a marketing number. I thought there's no way that they're actually paying attention to how many people and at 1,000 people, like it cut off our new people. And so,
so you had a lot of angry people who couldn't get in.
Angry, frustrated. I mean, like, but it was great. I mean, like there's a lot of energy. And so what ended up happening is over the next several weeks, we couldn't upgrade that limit. So we just started the webcast earlier and earlier. And so basically it would be filling up 5 minutes early and then 10 minutes early. And so basically like there was such a capacity desire for this thing that people were basically just like, just filling up the funnel.
Coupled with probably people who are out of work and looking for work or looking to upgrade their skills. So there's good timing in that sense. Yeah.
And then we sold recordings of it. We sold recordings for, I think, for $50. And we made $30,000 off of this first 10-week course, which,
that compared to previous revenues, is that a lot more than what you'd done previously?
Well, I think I mentioned this before. We were doing like $5,000 a year. Like it was not an economic engine. It was a love engine. It was not an economic engine.
Yeah.
And
so you kind of stumbled into a freemium model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a freemium model that really like everything inverted. And all of a sudden it became the driver that kept my company alive. So my IT company actually now, instead of the company having to pour $100,000 a year into the training company,
turned around the other way.
It turned around. The training company was now generating a lot. We did a Photoshop course that did $30,000 in sales. We did an Illustrator course. I was talking with Chase. So you asked like when I met Chase.
Yeah. Chase, by the way, very well regarded photographer who at the time had built a social media following, I guess you'd call it, early days of social media.
Absolutely. Chase Jarvis was one of the big photographers like worldwide in Seattle, like was early on in terms of doing online education and just sharing the behind the scenes of what was considered to be kind of a secret like untalked about back end of how photographers work.
Mm.
He'd been a client of mine, I think, for about a decade. So remember,
Mm.
I supported the biggest ad agencies, design firms, and photography studios in the Seattle area. And Chase was one of the biggest photography studios in the area and had been a client of mine for years.
Got it. Okay. So you had a working relationship. Yeah.
I think we were on a panel together at AIGA at the Graphic Artists Guild. And at a break, I was telling about like what was happening with the Photoshop course. And we just started talking. And basically over about the next 4 or 5 months, kind of like spec'd out moving this thing that had been in prototype stage inside of my company. We spun it out in 2010. So the in terms of time frame, the 2008 is when the economy tanked. Around the end of 2009 is when I kind of knew that I needed to do something with my IT company. So my Hail Mary with the education company was around 2009. And then between 2009 and 2010 is when Chase and I were talking, and then we launched CreativeLive in 2010.
And then by that point, was your IT company back on more stable footing?
So by that time it was okay. It was okay. So
Okay.
I sold my IT company to two employees.
2 key employees, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell the story about these employees, because they'd actually left and you had a bunch of different different relationships with them in different capacities.
Yeah. Tim, who is now one of the owners of CreativeLive, so it's Tim and Kyle, had been with me for about a decade. Tim actually was a consultant of mine that worked at Washington Mutual. He ended up leaving my company, going to Washington Mutual, and in doing so, invoking our non-compete that we had with our employees. So we actually negotiated his exit, where I was working to enforce my non-compete with him as he was going to my biggest client. So we negotiated him exiting as an employee to my biggest client, where he became my boss.
So rather than you putting your foot down saying, absolutely not, no way, I'm going to enforce this non-compete, it sounds like it was more of an amicable discussion.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always, for the most part, I am always trying to make sure that I'm taking care of me, but I'm also, I try to play win-win. So when he left, I'm just trying to make sure that we're taken care of as long as and he's taken care of. And so basically, he actually was able to use it as a lever because he didn't really want to be the IT guy. So he actually appreciated being able to say, I can't do this work that I've been doing with you, because he was going to do other work. And so he got to use us. He got to keep using Kyle. And then a couple of years later, Kyle left. So Kyle left. And so he actually went to start his own gig. And we actually even negotiated. We went through his client list, and I let him buy out or gift. I basically went through his client list and gave him a couple clients that he was really core with, that allowed him to kind of start his practice in return for him not going after other clients and just kind of negotiating the terms under which he was going to leave. I think a lot of service providers are so afraid of this that they never talk it out, and create a lot of dead end conversations where basically you have two people like not trying to negotiate. So we're basically really proactively trying to work this out. And then when Washington Mutual went out of business because of all that, Tim left Washington Mutual. I lost my biggest client. Tim lost his current job. And then Tim and Kyle went into business together as competitors.
Okay. Competitors to what you were doing. Okay.
Exactly. Meanwhile, I had some other, I had other team members, but yeah, they were now competitors. And Kyle had a few clients that we'd passed along to him. And then, you can interpret this however, and then they did a marketing campaign that included people that Kyle was expressly prohibited from marketing to.
Okay.
And that could be,
found out about it.
I found out about it. It could be a mistake, or it could be intentional. But we then had a conversation about that. And I went back and enforced our non-compete with Kyle. I think in a way that was not that kept relationship. It was, I don't think it burned our relationship. I mean, it would probably put us under pressure. But then about 6 to 9 months later, when I was selling my business, I actually had an offer from a couple other IT companies. I wasn't really feeling good about it. I was able to go back to Tim and Kyle and say, hey, I'm selling my business. This is what we're getting offered.
Yeah.
If we can work it out, I would rather have you guys run this, because you already know how to do everything. Like, all the clients know you. And we worked out a deal. They bought it. what they bought it for totally worked for them. It also provided some support for me and my family over the next 3 years as we migrated over to the CreativeLive startup when we weren't getting income.
Nice to have that cushion while you're working on building up CreativeLive. Yeah.
And today is what, I think we're a decade later. Kyle and Tim are still the IT company that supports my wife. I am not my wife's tech support.
That's nice.
And
it's good for marriage.
and so I like to say like this is a reference I can give. These are people, like, if you ever want to know who Craig is, these are people that reported to me as employees, that I reported to as clients, that we have had adversarial relationships or competitive relationships, and where we have actually negotiated some uncomfortable non-compete conversations, and eventually who bought my business.
So nice to have all that relationship like that.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that they, that every report they would have of me would be, but they know me on all of that. And so I love, like, they are the referral I give, because there is not an aspect of me in business that they have not seen some side of.
Now let's talk about CreativeLive. I must have done it probably around 2013, 2014 or something like that. As I said, my friend Dory Clark was doing it. She had me come in as a guest to the San Francisco studio. And this was not a small operation at this point. So, reflecting back on what you said earlier about the difficulties of managing a lot of people, now you've got a huge operation. I mean, it was like going down to the NBC studios or something like that. There's makeup, there's hair, there's a green room, there's a studio, huge studio, and rows and rows of desks. And then there was a party afterwards. I had a blast when I did it. It was really a lot of fun. But what was that like for you, getting to the point where this, I don't know if you took on VC capital or not, but it's a huge operation at some point.
Yeah, I was laughing when you said it's not a small operation. At that point, the point you saw it, I think it was $1 million a month in payroll. If not, we were, within striking distance of that. It was.
I believe it for sure. Yeah,
it was a big operation. So no, It exploded like a rocket because we had just hit the economic downturn. And so basically, when we launched in 2010, it was messy. I mean, it was a messy business, but startups, I find, are messy. But we hit the audience, and the audience was interested. We were serving a market, and they rewarded us with purchases and everything else. So we grew tremendously. I think we did $1 million, $1.2 million in revenue in the first year, and just grew and grew and grew. 2 years into this, we did take VC funding from an A round from a group in Silicon Valley, Greylock, and
that's a top tier VC.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we were watching the Facebook movie, and like there are characters in play that were part of our dynamic that are being so that are being played by various famous actors on the TV.
That's funny.
And that was like a business education on steroids. I learned a lot about scaling. I learned a lot about what where my strengths are in scaling, and where my weaknesses are in scaling, and in terms of what type of personalities and team are needed to really be able to like take things to the next level.
And what was it like for Chase also too? I mean, most photographers are probably like, small group operations, or they have no one working for them. It's an unusual dynamic for someone to go from being a photographer, a well-regarded photographer, to running a big business like this.
I mean, Chase was very much a visionary. So I think, like, from a dynamic standpoint, Chase is very much a visionary, very focused on brand, very focused on audience perception and connections within the community, and very much less detail oriented in terms of finances or technology or other things like that. And I'm kind of the reverse. I'm much more detail oriented, much more focused on kind of the technical side, and where I'm involved with creative is more I'm creating the structure around creative as opposed to creating the creative.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, Chase's company, as a photography studio, he always was a fairly large company. So he always had like a good, healthy number of employees. Like he always had like a team of like 5 to 10 people. Yeah. And that is about the size of my company. So in terms of both of us had different coping styles and different like personality styles, but neither of us were prepared or qualified for what CreativeLive grew into.
Now, at what point did you say in your bio now
Mhm.
that your passion really is taking businesses, kind of the accelerator model,
Mhm.
from 100, 200, $300,000 to $1
Mhm.
million bucks or more? That seems like
Mhm.
really what you really enjoy.
Mhm.
But there must have been a point where you looked around, you're like, all these different people, you don't know their names, and maybe you're like, I don't know if this is for me. Did you reach a point like that with CreativeLive?
I did, but also I knew from the beginning that I wasn't going to be CEO.
Mm.
So I was never I was a CEO of CreativeLive in the early incubator days while we were figuring out where product market fit was. And then we brought in John Cunningham, who as a CEO at that time, to basically kind of like start to build the systems. And John really knew how to basically put together the executive team, build the team, all that.
Mm.
Um, and then Chase and I basically reported to John in different areas. So we may have been on the board, we may have been like founders, and there was this kind of triangle dynamic where John was the CEO and fought for the control that the CEO needs to have, and then you had two founders who were major stakeholders and also necessary components and employees to make the system run.
Did you ever find at some point that you weren't sure where you fit in that dynamic?
Oh yeah. And at some point it grew to a point where I did move on, because at some point in 2015, when Chase became CEO, after we'd gone through a couple rounds, like I did move on to the next phase for me personally, because I really realized I love the act of building a company and creating a company to about that $1 billion a year mark. Basically, that, like, for me, the hands-on act of creating, solving, finding the product market fit, working with creatives, basically all that struggle of figuring out where, how to build a sustainable business that can break $1 million. That is like my sweet spot.
Mm-hmm.
The next march, going from 1 million to 10 million and then beyond, I move into a mentorship role for different people, for the executive team, for different areas, but it actually gets to a place where I'm not the person to lead it or handle all the details in that. And so I would say that's something I know about myself now. I think that emotionally I was less comfortable with that during CreativeLive. Like during CreativeLive, it felt like power was being stripped from me. Like I was discovering this about myself at the time and learning what it took to grow, and maybe in denial or struggling with it. Whereas today it is something I build into my program. Today, like I get companies up to a place, and then basically around the time we're crossing 1 million, I'm also kind of cherry picking who is going to be the executive team that's going to take it to that next level.
Yeah.
And how are we going to basically build that team so it can go and thrive.
It'd be great if we came with an instruction manual that told us these things, but it's really once you cross those bridges that you learn those things. So that natural transition to some of the more current work you've done with Sue Bryce. So Sue Bryce was a similar kind of idea here. She was a well-regarded photographer, right? So talk about how that partnership came about.
So Sue was actually an instructor at CreativeLive. So she was one of she taught her first class in 2012. And then around 2014, 2015, one of the things that happens with instructors on CreativeLive, especially as things were developing, because when CreativeLive started, nobody knew how to do live streaming. The technology was all hard. CreativeLive made a lot of instructors really big and famous, and made them a lot of money in a really short period of time. But then when you have
some people like Tim Ferriss's of the world, Brene Brown's, that are now much bigger individuals, that you can claim credit for some of the growth in their career.
So those two, Tim and Renee, so Brene, like they were huge when they got involved with CreativeLive. But yes, there's a lot of people that like kind of like used CreativeLive as an initial springboard for really significant impact. Yeah. And so Sue got to a certain level of impact, and then made a conscious choice that she was going to go do her own thing. And so she did that. A little bit later, Chase became CEO. I had kind of made my peace in terms of like where my role in CreativeLive was, and CreativeLive was growing to a place where I was an owner, but I wasn't really involved in it. And so I went through, like, I exited CreativeLive, still an owner, but basically went through my non-compete earn out period and all that. And at some point, Sue and I got together, and like, we're both free of CreativeLive. She's been doing her own thing, and she had her online education company, was doing about $600,000 a year. and she knew she was like bumping into a non-sustainable place for her. She was either going to blow it up or get rid of it, or she was basically running into her own limitations in terms of what she wanted to do and where she was skilled. And then I came in along with a couple other partners. We came in and basically partnered with Sue Bryce, created the incubator company that I was doing, that I basically did a lot of work with. And we basically took Sue Bryce, I think, we basically built Sue Bryce into a company that was doing about $6 million a year. Eventually, it got sold and acquired by Emerald, one of the biggest in-person trade show companies out there, and that became really like the first big incubator company that I took first to $1 million, or was part of a team that took first to $1 million, and then built out the team that could basically grow that to the next level.
And now you've got another one you're working on. This is the KaisaFit.
Yep. And then KaisaFit we started in 2019, which is an online fitness platform.
Good timing, by the way, leading right into the pandemic. Boy, you planned that really well.
I'll tell you what, it was really lucky. And it's also really lucky that we did our prototyping so quick, because we basically started in June of 2019. And if we had not had kind of the scrappy prototyping, like prove out the audience, find product market fit mentality, we would have missed the opportunity that was about to be laid on the entire planet. And when I say opportunity, like terrible disaster, but but we were selling online, we were selling workouts that people could do in their living room.
Yeah.
At a time when the entire world is about to be locked in their living room for a couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there must have been some moments, though, of fear going into it, or were there not any moments of fear?
Oh, there were. Yes. I mean, fear. There's always fear. So for me, like I was going to ask you where: fear of the pandemic, fear of like launching, fear of failure, fear my life is fear. It's
interesting how many entrepreneurs and businesses that grew through the pandemic, at least the first month, 2 months. No one knew anything, had no idea what was going on. They're scared for their family, for their parents, for their kids, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, hockey stick starts.
I would say also that was both luck and also a choice. We had a conversation. We had a conversation both at Sue Bryce Education and also at KaisaFit, because I tend to have one company that is in scaling mode that I'm mentoring in. So I'm not using much, and I have one company I'm tending to be growing. And so I'm usually have time between a couple companies. But in both companies, we had a conversation about how we were going to respond to the pandemic, which is we could basically take ourselves out of the game and just, huddle in and wait for this to blow over. Or we could look for the unique gift that is buried in here that only exists for us if we have the opportunity to see it. And in both cases, we ended up basically making some shifts to what we were doing, really leaning into it, rather than running from it. I'm doing a lot of marketing, and in both cases, both businesses just exploded. We were lucky in the positioning, like we are the type of business that did explode. But also, and we've not really talked about EO Accelerator, which you mentioned I was the chair of EO Accelerator, but I was also
my next topic. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say I was coaching an EO Accelerator at that time. And so when the pandemic hit, we were 6 months into my coaching program with my small group. And so we had our first Zoom call, because none of us, we were all trapped at home.
Yeah.
Where I'm the coach, and we've got 6 entrepreneurs that have different businesses, including businesses that are event businesses that are completely what they believe their business is does not exist anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of businesses had to completely pivot, or else they would do nothing for 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And basically my challenge was I gave them, I offered 3 kind of like concepts for them. Just talk about, first of all, like, how's your family? How's everyone doing? Like, how's the health? Like, where are we? Is there anything you need to do just to cover yourself? Number 2, are there any hard decisions that are long-term decisions in your business you've been putting off? Because there's this saying, like, never waste a crisis. Like, we're in the middle of a crisis. This is the time that you can make a bunch of really, really hard decisions that are going to just basically be like swept away emotionally by everything else that's happening right now. So, like, if there's a long-term thing you've been in denial about, this may be the time to look at it.
Yeah.
And then number 3, is there a unique opportunity in this circumstance that you have not been seeing because of fear?
Yeah. And I have to say, so EO Entrepreneurs Organization, which
Mhm.
is the parent organization
Mhm.
of the Accelerator program, such an amazing organization during that crisis. I think it's like it's like a template for what to do, because every day I'm receiving, and I was in an Accelerator program at the beginning of the pandemic. They're sending a text message, an email of a litany of different online educational activities that were educating people about things to do, marketing ideas, how to do the PPP, things like that. And it was just amazing to see people step it up and help one another.
Absolutely. And one company in particular, like one company in the small group I was coaching, is a event business. Basically, she did audio visual for hotels. Well, in the pandemic, audio visual for hotels, there's just, I mean, like her business went from almost EO qualifying, almost $1 million a year to zero in a month. Like she had hundreds of thousands of dollars of cancellations, all in this what she was dealing with. And she pivoted. She impresses me like very few entrepreneurs I have met. Like she took a step back and said, look at, okay, what do I have? I have crew, I have cars, I have logistics. And she basically called up food companies that were like delivering to people that are now to like rework for home. And she basically repivoted her entire company to provide emergency food and delivery services.
Wow.
Or like basically utilizing what she's got. And then at the same time was building out a studio in what was once her storage space to try to create some type of online space for charities or other people to be able to do events and try to get to some semblance of business.
Wow.
So, and even best, she did this for 2 years. She became EO qualified at the beginning of this year, and she is now an EO member in my forum. So she is now my forum mate so cool. In my forum.
That's great.
And
that's great.
And just extraordinary. And there's stories like that. Like there were so many people that struggled, but also so many people that basically responded, try to figure out something. And there's nothing like having a group of fellow entrepreneurs, some succeeding, some but all being honest and pulling for each other, and like creating the sense that we can choose how we're going to respond to this crisis and how we can navigate it.
Right. To be deliberate and intentional rather than to just let it happen to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to look for the opportunities. That does not mean denying the crisis, but it also means that there are unique opportunities that do exist in every crisis.
Yeah. I mean, I was, Slack is one of those. I think that was a failed different startup, and they were about to go out of business. And they're like, what else could we do? And they had this internal tool that they built. Like, well, maybe we should look into that. And it ends up being a huge multi-billion-dollar company. Lots of examples like that. This has been amazing, Craig. I love talking to you. We're almost out of time. I love to ask my gratitude question, which is, I'm a big fan of gratitude, especially expressing gratitude to peers and contemporaries and mentors and partners who've helped you along the way in your journey. Who would you want to shout out publicly?
Wow, there are so many. I'm gonna name check a couple. Like the one that comes to mind for me is Celeste. Celeste Olds, who was our first producer at CreativeLive, who reported to me, but took me aside one day and talked to me really straightforwardly about how my behavior was being disruptive for her team and distracting her team from being able to do the work that we had hired them to do.
Wow, that takes some cojones to say that. Wow.
And did so in a way that grew trust instead of breaking trust. And I think Celeste probably gave me more opportunity to learn about myself and grow than any individual. I mean, there are so many individuals I've learned from, but like, I'm going to just call out Celeste on this one because she taught me what a producer can do. She taught me my superhero. But Celeste is my superhero. Celeste became in there's the entrepreneur operating system. There's this thing called the integrator, this vision. She basically taught me what a differently skilled person can do if we build trust together. And she takes my vision and I give her the power to execute with what she knows to execute. CreativeLive would not be what CreativeLive became, and I would not be the entrepreneur that I would be if I had not learned from Celeste how I can work with people like Celeste. So it's not just that Celeste like did all this for me for CreativeLive and like made an incredible team and grew an incredible team. Celeste taught me how to work better with future producers, and that there was this role that could unlock an amazing amount of creativity and creation for me that I didn't know existed.
Craig, I know you're super passionate about the EO Accelerator program in Seattle. So where can people go learn about that, and where can they also go to learn about you and connect with you?
So the best way to go if you're in Seattle and you're interested in EO Accelerator, go to SeattleAccelerator.org, and there is a single page that kind of has all the summary of that, SeattleAccelerator.org. Best way to connect with me is look for me on LinkedIn or go to CraigSwanson.org. It's Craig Swanson, not .org, not .com. I don't own the .com, the .org.
Got to get on top of that. All right, Craig. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.